Good morning, everyone. Today we will be examining a group that we have yet to cover on this course, Jewish Europeans. We will be looking at the changing trends in Judaism around the turn of the 19th century and the ways in which these trends affected Jewish people's relations with their Gentile neighbours. Jewish people had lived in large numbers in Europe since the time of the Roman Empire, when, after a series of failed uprisings and their banning from the city of Jerusalem, they were forced to leave the Roman province of Judea. During the medieval period, most Jewish people lived separately from Gentiles. They were easily identifiable thanks to their different forms of dress and their different religious and cultural customs. In large towns, Jewish people were often segregated into specific overcrowded areas known as ghettos. These differences, as well as their reputation for being wealthy, made Jewish people easy targets for Christian mobs, who often blamed Jewish people for acts of nature such as outbreaks of disease. Some countries expelled their entire Jewish populations and seized their property. Other countries just turned to violent massacre to accomplish the same goals. Many Jewish Europeans sought to escape the intolerance shown towards them in regions such as England or the Italian peninsula by settling in Eastern Europe, particularly today's Ukraine. These Jewish Eastern Europeans lived a more rural life than the urban-centered Jewish residents of Western Europe. Such were the freedoms enjoyed under the rule of the Polish kings that the period of Jewish settlement in Poland and Poland-Lithuania during the Middle Ages has been referred to as a Golden Age. Other Jewish groups in Muslim areas of Europe, such as southern Spain, also enjoyed freedom to practice their religion. The growth of the Ottoman Empire was a blessing for Europe's Jewish population, as the empire represented a safe haven free from overt persecution. As the centuries wore on, a key question asked by European Jews was the extent to which they wished to remain separate from the wider societies in which they lived. A small but increasing number of Jewish families gave their services to the European nobility and governments. Representatives of these families served as lawyers and bankers, excelling due to their high levels of literacy. Success in this world was, however, defined by the patronage of a noble backer, and life was precarious during times of political and economic upheaval. Other Jewish people, often refugees from the Spanish Inquisition, integrated themselves as merchants in the growing West European cities of London, Antwerp, and Amsterdam. Once again, however, it should be stressed that at least half of Europe's Jewish residents, and probably more, continued to live rural and fairly poor lives not too different from those of the Gentile peasants that they had as neighbours. In Poland, the Jewish Golden Age abruptly came to an end in the 17th century as the population became the target of foreign armies such as the Cossacks who roamed in the region of today's Ukraine. The 18th century saw the emergence of an important intellectual movement, the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment. The Haskalah called for Jewish Europeans to educate themselves and their children not only in religious texts, but also in the latest scientific and scholarly trends. Haskalah called for the revival of study on Jewish history and of the Hebrew language, which had widely fallen out of use. Haskalah scholars called on Jewish Europeans to integrate themselves in the states in which they lived, and earned the wrath of many rabbis by calling upon Jewish people to throw out old traditions such as their unique forms of clothing. Indeed, many Haskalah adherents soon gave up their Jewish identity entirely. Overall, Haskalah can be summed up as a movement to remove the walls, both the mental and the physical walls, that had separated Jewish people from the outside world. The movement was particularly strong in Germany, which was home to Europe's best educated Jewish population. In Eastern Europe, however, a movement developed that rejected everything that the Haskalah embraced. This was Hasidic Judaism, which called upon Jewish people to embrace the mystical and the spiritual aspects of their faith. Hasidic Judaism was incredibly popular, especially in Poland, as it embraced uneducated Jewish people, pointing out that they were the equals to the literate and educated Jewish scholars. Hasidic Judaism was also regarded as more fun and more vibrant than the often dry Judaism of the West European scholars. Prayer, song, and simple acts of kindness were all held to hold a spark of the divine. Hasidic Judaism slowed integration, as it emphasized traditions that were considered alien by the majority of Gentiles. Concurrently, there, be- there began to be the slow stirrings of the currents that were later to develop into Zionism. Judaism had taught its adherents to bide their time and wait for the coming of the Messiah, when, in a moment of redemption, the Jewish people would be allowed to return to the Kingdom of Israel. From about 1700 onwards, voices began to be raised that called upon Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland and end the passive waiting for the Messiah. These efforts were aided by an increased interest in studying the subject of Judaism as one separate from wider history or theology. Scholars were able to rediscover many of the stories which occurred to the Jewish people after the events covered in the Talmud. The French Revolution was a significant event, not only for Jewish people in France, but also throughout Europe. As we discussed previously, Jewish people had a precarious position in the ancient regime and largely continued to be treated as outsiders in the country. The French revolutionary government, in its Declaration of Rights, made Jewish people full citizens of France in a process known as Emancipation. Jewish Frenchmen would hold the same rights as Gentile Frenchmen, including the right to practice their religion however they wished, with the stipulation that so long as it did not pose a threat to national security. In return, however, French revolutionary authorities expected Jewish citizens to assimilate into wider French culture, thus threatening many of their traditions and much of Jewish identity. Napoleon's conquests spread French revolutionary law regarding Jewish citizenship across Europe. In 1807, the French emperor called together a Grand Sanhedrin, or elected Jewish council, to discuss the Jewish policy to be pursued in the empire. This Sanhedrin declared that civil authority, for example Napoleon and his Napoleonic Code, was to have prominence over religious authority, and that Jewish Europeans should reject previous forms of worship and embrace modern bourgeois norms. Jewish services were expected to be updated to fit the so-called Age of Reason. Some services even brought in organ music, mixed-gendered seating, and services in languages other than Hebrew, such as German. Emperor Napoleon, who was at best suspicious of his Jewish subjects, encouraged these developments. His laws forced Jewish citizens to take names, and his government set up departments specifically for the monitoring of the Jewish people in the empire. At the same time as he mistrusted his Jewish subjects, Napoleon also allowed them a greater deal of freedom in how to live their lives than they had previously enjoyed. In particular, the impact of the French Empire's abolition of the ancient Jewish ghettos of Italy cannot be overstated. The emperor also made Judaism a religion equal to not only Protestantism in France, but also to the long-term state religion, Roman Catholicism. This would have been absolutely unthinkable 20 years previous. Meanwhile, although Napoleon's government departments monitored and corralled the Jewish people, they were also staffed and run by reforming rabbis and others who used their position to advance the status of Jewish Europeans, so as to better integrate them into wider society. The legacy of the Jewish Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution came in the form of Reform Judaism. In the 1840s, a series of synods met in Germany that offered widespread changes to their faith. Use of Hebrew was to be limited, circumcision questioned, and moral considerations were said to be just as important as Talmudic law. Gender barriers were once more questioned and altered. Social reforms, in the present, replaced waiting for the Messiah as the driving moral imperative of Judaism. Some Reformed Jewish people even considered themselves as having a divine mission to improve the lives of Christians through their moral teaching. Whilst Reformed Judaism was moderately successful in Germany, throughout most of Europe it failed, only to really take off in the United States, being spread to this new country by Jewish emigrants in the 1840s and the 1850s. Most Jewish people and Jewish rabbis in Europe instead began practicing a slightly altered form of their traditional beliefs. This is known as Neo-orthodoxy. Neo-orthodoxy was designed as a way of squaring the requirements of the Jewish traditions with the challenges and the opportunities of modern life. It did this by separating religion from culture. One could maintain a Jewish religious affiliation whilst embracing, for example, the French culture. This embrace of Western norms was treated with suspicion by Hasidic Jews who instead advocated a renewed separation from the Gentiles. This process of separation was made easier in the lands of the Russian Empire, where, from 1791 onwards, Jewish people were confined to live in the so-called Pale of Settlement. The Pale consisted of the westernmost lands of the Russian Empire, lands that had formerly belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the medieval Jewish Golden Age. In contrast, however, life in the 19th century Pale was extremely hard. Poverty was rampant, and it was common for Jewish villagers to share what they had with their wider village community. The confinement of Jewish communities to specific areas made them easy targets for violent attacks or pogroms, which became more and more frequent as the 19th century went on. Some Jewish people escaped the violence and poverty by emigrating to London, Berlin, and Amsterdam. More took the decision to make a new life for themselves in the United States. As we will see in future lectures as we revisit the topic, however, Zionism proved to be a compelling inspiration for more and more Jews who longed or came to long for a return of the Kingdom of Israel and the Palestinian homeland.